Topping today's news, the former Minister of Youth, Sports and Culture in court to answer charges of fraud. Members of Parliament begin debate on the new Public Procurement Act. Former Cabinet Minister Leslie Miller weighs in on the debate between the government and gas station owners, and condolences continue to pour in for the late Ed Bethel. Good evening, Bahamas. I'm Jarino Saunders. This is your JCN Evening News. It's a pleasure to have you join us. Former Minister of Youth, Sports and Culture Lanisha Roll, her husband Von Tenkin Roll, and three other individuals, including Wilfred Roll Jr., Godfrey Burrows, and Alfred Mortimer, appeared in court this morning to face charges on matters related to fraud. Mrs. Roll appeared in a somber mood as she faced Senior Magistrate Carolyn Volk Evans. The charges, totaling 18 counts and valued at $500,000, are related to contracts received for the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture and the National Sports Authority. The former minister was charged with 1 count of bribery and 15 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. One of the conspiracy to commit fraud charges involves her husband. Meanwhile, Mr. Mortimer was charged with 1 count of bribery, Luke Burrows with 1 count of fraud by false pretenses, while Burrows and Wilfred Roll were charged together on 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud by false pretenses. When court began, the former cabinet minister entered a not guilty plea for 4 of her charges. However, those pleas were vacated because the prosecution said they planned to proceed with a voluntary bill of indictment. Mrs. Roll was released on $150,000 bail, and she must sign in at the Western Police Station on the last Monday of each month by 7 p.m. Her husband received $50,000 bail and must sign in at the same police station. Mr. Mortimer, Mr. Burrows, and Wilfred Roll each received $10,000 bail and must sign in at a police station closest to their residence. They will return to court for the service of a voluntary bill of indictment on May 31st. In February of 2021, Mrs. Roll resigned from her ministerial position and told reporters that justice will prevail. At that time, an audit of the National Sports Authority was taking place, as well as a lockdown of the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture, ordered by the then Prime Minister, Dr. Hubert Minnis. Speaking of the former Prime Minister, today Dr. Minnis was guarded with his words regarding the former Minister of Youth, Sports and Culture, Lanisha Roll, and the charges of misappropriation of funds against her in the magistrate's court. Dr. Minnis says he knows very little about the matter.
I don't know anything other than what I've seen, and so I would have the same information as the general public. Nothing else.
During his term as Prime Minister, Dr. Minnis took a strong stance to rid the government of corruption, as this is the second member of the former Minnis administration to be charged with fraud and/or money laundering charges. When asked if he thinks his words are possibly coming back to haunt his administration, Dr. Minnis had this response.
Wait. You cannot accuse individuals of corruption.
Well, allege.
Every Bahamian in our society is innocent until proven otherwise. So you must take that word out. You cannot try to bias or accuse anybody. Thank you very much.
So when you say you're hoping that she has a fair trial, is that fair to say?
I said I have read the same document information that you all have.
The former Seabreeze Member of Parliament resigned from her cabinet-appointed post in February of 2021, giving little to no details as to why she chose to step down. In November, amid rumors she was being investigated by police, Roll defended her record, saying as far as she was aware, proper procedure was followed during her tenure as minister. The Davis administration intends to repeal and replace a compendium of financial bills as debate began in the House of Assembly on Wednesday morning. According to the Prime Minister, the bills which were passed under the former Minnis administration were a clear failure, as the former administration did not ensure the legislation were practical and consistent with sound public policy. Leslie Bastien has more in this next report.
Parliamentarians in the lower chamber began debate on a compendium of bills which the Davis administration intends to repeal and replace, including the Public Finance Management Act 2021, the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2018, sections of the Financial Administration Audit Act, and the Public Procurement Act 2021. In leading off the debate, Prime Minister Philip Davis told parliamentarians that his government is correcting issues surrounding practical implementation and delivering improved governmental financial management and transparency on behalf of the Bahamian people, as he says financial management principles are the cornerstone of his administration's efforts to improve the government's fiscal health. The Prime Minister says that his administration has already seen its commitment to effective policy making and best practices yielding stellar results.
Even as we successfully meet our fiscal targets, we know that there is more to be done. That is why improved financial management and public procurement are so critical. When governments are operating more efficiently and more transparently, funds are used in ways that yield a higher return on investment the public can see and feel. Eliminating wastage and inefficiencies is a high priority item that positively impacts every other item on our agenda. Our goal is to achieve unprecedented policy wins for the Bahamian people while being the best run government in our history. Yes. That's our goal.
Now, the former Minister administration passed the Public Finance Management Act and Public Procurement Act just before the 2021 general elections. However, Prime Minister Davis has gone on record to say that the Public Procurement Act was not only rushed but unworkable. He says policy making is about much more than passing laws.
There is a need to think about practical elements like resources at hand, internal capacity, operational barriers, and stakeholders buy-in. There's also a need to think about the impact of the policy, including any unintended or unforeseen impacts. When you pass a law at the end of your term, you don't really give yourself any time to implement policies in a practical way. As the side opposite claims that the unworkable legislation they left on the books, now listen to this, they claim that the unworkable legislation, that's what we say, that they left on the books, they say it was effective. That's what they say. Well, the real question is, how would they even know?
Prime Minister Davis contends that his administration is taking its commitment to transparency and sound financial management seriously.
The bills before us are the product of a deep consultation with public sector, financial management, and procurement experts who have communicated great concern about the lack of practicality in the existing legislation. We must let common sense reign as far as effective policy making and legislating is concerned. Rules that cannot be practically implemented are not good rules. A policy that is introduced without preparatory work being done is doomed to fail. A law that does not account for local context cannot effectively address the legislative needs of the government. Everyone sitting in this honorable house today is aware of these basic concepts, but there are some who feign ignorance as they seek to hide their own failures and ignore the advancements being made today. Madam Speaker, the work of the government must be grounded in the facts.
The Prime Minister further contends that governments must do what is effective and in alignment with the best practices as well as the local reality. He says his administration's track record speaks for itself as the New Day government has surpassed the fiscal performance of the past few years, eclipsing the previous administration's pre-pandemic and pre-Dorian years. For Jcn News, I'm Lissy Bastian.
Thanks for that report, Lissy. The official opposition says it cannot support amendments to the Public Procurement Act as presented in the new bill for an act to repeal and replace the Public Procurement Act of 2021. This according to Opposition Shadow Minister for Finance, Kwesi Thompson, as he debated the bill this morning in the House of Assembly. We hear more on his contributions in this next report. As the government seeks to improve the Public Procurement Act, which it has described in the past as unworkable, opposition member of Parliament for East Grand Bahama, Kwesi Thompson, who is also the Shadow Minister of Finance, says the opposition cannot support the amendments to the Public Procurement Act as presented by the Davis administration. While making his contribution to the debate in the House of Assembly on Wednesday morning, Mr. Thompson and the opposition questioned the government's commitment to transparency and believe many of the amendments reduce the standards set by the Minnis administration's Procurement Act.
Madam Speaker, in short, unless the government can provide a far more compelling reason for the changes being made in these pieces of legislation, we on this side, fortunately, cannot support these amendments. And I will go through the reasons and go through the individual amendments as to why we cannot support them.
Mr. Thompson went on to list several concerns the opposition has with the amendments, including concerns with the new Public Financial Management Act, which takes away powers that the previous act gave to the Public Accounts Treasurer and places them in the hands of the Minister of Finance, including the ability for the Treasurer to compel public servants to give evidence under oath. He says the new amendments take the teeth out of the Public Procurement Act because it now lacks an offences section.
They've taken away the entire section that speaks to offenses. This bill had a complete section that provided offenses. If you did this, it is an offense. If you did that, it is an offense. If you did this, it's an offense. They've taken everything out. They didn't just adjust it to say, well, this isn't workable, or that isn't workable, or we can change this, or we can make that work better. They took the whole thing out. So you've taken the teeth out of the legislation. Yeah. Wow. The only thing that provides, well, I won't say the only thing, but the best thing that provided the accountability for persons in this act was the offenses section. That if you breach this act, here's the consequences. If you do this, here's the consequences. Well, they've taken that entire thing out.
Before wrapping up his contribution, Mr. Thompson also addressed the amendments made to the time limit that a person can serve as the Chief Procurement Officer, which in the previous act was a maximum of 10 years. The new act seeks to make that tenure unlimited. Mr. Thompson says the opposition does not think this is a good idea.
You've also taken away the tenure clause for the Chief Procurement Officer. The Chief Procurement Officer in the previous act gave you 5 years and then an additional 5 years. You could not serve more than 10. Next. You've taken that clause out. So what is the justification for making that term unlimited? And we don't see the justification for doing so, because that is a clause that really should be, is a profession that you really should be training persons, and people should not be getting that comfortable in that procurement as a Chief Procurement Officer because of the importance of it. But therefore, Madam Speaker, unfortunately, we on this side cannot support the amendments as they are now.
And finally, in this segment, the disagreement between the government and the Bahamas Petroleum Retailers Association concerning gas margins wages on, with Prime Minister Philip Davis recently asking the association to give the government 2 weeks to address their concerns. Meanwhile, speaking as a former minister with responsibility for the nation's fuel supply, Leslie Miller, while appearing on a local radio talk show today, gave some insight on the current situation.
You know, I was Minister of Trade and Industry with responsibility for fuel a few years back. Right now, as it stands, the importer gets 33 cents a gallon for fuel that they import into this country. Mm-hmm. The so-called retailer, which is not really, gets 54 cents on a gallon. Last year and the year before, those so-called retailers, their gross margins on the sale of fuel exceeded $30 million.
While speaking on the petroleum industry, the former PLP minister revealed that many of those involved in the retail segment of the industry do not have much control of that industry. He says there are certain elements about the industry that those not a part of the industry may not be aware of.
They glorified managers.
2 operators in this country, New Providence, own their own gas station. The rest are renters. The fuel tanks, the fuel pumps, the food,
The fridge. My God.
the freezers, whatever takes place in there belongs to either Shell, Esso, or Texaco. Now you tell me how they're going to close down. The owners want them to fight their war because every time we give an increase, the government give an increase. Say, for example, the government say, okay, we're going to give the retailers an additional 25 cents. You then have to give the importers about 10 cents also because they coming at you. So they push these little fellas
So
to get an
essentially,
increase.
it'll be an increase from the 33 cents to 43 cents.
Exactly. So they push them to do the dirty work for them.
God, this
Last Thursday, while speaking in the Senate, Minister of Economic Affairs Michael Halkitis said the government will not entertain any increase in margins if it means the price of gas at the pumps will increase. He appealed to the Petroleum Retailers Association to talk with the government. The petroleum retailers expressed their disappointment in the minister and Minister Halkitis and asked him to reconsider his position. Presently, the government collects $1.60 from every gallon of gas at the pumps, while the gas station owners collect 54 cents from each gallon. We'll take a break here. We'll be right back after these commercials.